Being a police officer in a small town in Minnesota isn't exactly what you'd call an exciting career, but it isn't bad either. In fact, compared to working law enforcement in a major city like New York or Los Angeles, where things are constantly happening, it's relatively calm and safe. The town I serve has only about 10,000 residents, tucked far out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of open farmland. Real crime is rare, and when it does happen, it's usually minor. Drunken locals getting into fights at one of the 3 bars downtown, teenagers causing a bit of vandalism, small-time theft, the occasional drunk driver, disorderly conduct, or, once in a while, a break-in. The most serious cases I dealt with were a couple of domestic disputes and assaults, and even those were infrequent. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one case that never left me, one that still lingers in the back of my mind. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I said, it's a quiet town. Some people might even call it boring. The kind of rural, out-of-the-way farming community you've probably driven through on the highway without a second glance, just passing by on your way somewhere more interesting. The kind of place where nothing unusual ever happens, or at least that's what you'd assume. And for the most part, you'd be right. But there's one case I've never been able to shake. One case that still makes my blood run cold whenever I think about it. One case I've never been able to explain, no matter how much I try to make sense of it. It all goes back to what happened to old Mrs. Garrity 7 years ago. At the time, I'd already been on the force for about 5 years. It was early spring of 2014. Our entire department consisted of just 5 officers. Myself, my partner Jerry, Pete and Vance, who handled night patrol, and the chief. Then there was Karen, an older woman who used to be a librarian and now worked part-time as our dispatcher. The department itself was located inside the town's municipal building. Nothing fancy. Just 2 small offices, one for the chief and one shared by the rest of us, along with 3 holding cells in the back. Not that they were ever all filled at once. One overcast, rainy afternoon, sometime in late March or early April, Jerry and I were out in our cruiser doing a routine patrol when Karen's voice came over the radio. She reported a possible 1082 in progress at the Garrity residence on Turner Road. For anyone unfamiliar, 10-82 is the code for a burglary. We acknowledged the call and immediately turned the car around, heading toward her place. I wasn't particularly worried. In fact, I already had a pretty good idea who had made the call. Eileen Garrity was an elderly widow who lived alone in a rundown farmhouse on the edge of town. She was probably in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, and had been by herself ever since her husband passed away from a stroke a few years earlier. They had 2 grown children, but neither of them lived nearby, and they almost never came to visit. After her husband's death, she'd gained a reputation around town. Some people politely called her eccentric. Others were less kind and just said she was crazy. She rarely left her house, had her groceries delivered once a week, and mostly kept to herself. A recluse, really. The reason people talked was because she'd become increasingly paranoid over the years. She'd called the police multiple times for things that didn't make much sense, claiming there were intruders moving around in her attic, or that she'd seen strange lights and unidentified flying objects hovering over her cornfield. There were plenty of other calls, too. Every single one turned out to be a false alarm. The intruders in her attic ended up being raccoons that had gotten in through the roof, and the so-called UFOs were most likely just military aircraft from a National Guard base about 50 miles west flying overhead. Myself, Jerry, Pete, and the others had all responded to her calls at one point or another, and by then, we all knew the routine pretty well. Vance had been there too, just like the rest of us, each of us taking turns responding to her calls during our shifts. None of us ever got openly annoyed with her, or treated her badly. If anything, we humored her. We'd check the house, walk the property, make a show of inspecting everything just to ease her nerves. Eventually she'd calm down, thank us, and we'd head out, only for the whole cycle to repeat again, weeks or months later. Truth be told, those occasional visits were about the most interesting thing that ever broke up the monotony of the job. When we'd report Mrs. Garrity's latest emergency to the chief, whether it was Bigfoot wandering around her yard or a giant snake hiding in her basement, he'd just sigh and shake his head. Whenever Vance and Pete handled her calls, they'd always fill us in afterward at shift change. Pete would usually smirk in a way that felt a little mean, spinning a finger near his temple before heading out. Jerry and I never found it funny. Mostly we just felt bad for her. It couldn't have been easy, being old, fragile, nervous, and completely alone in that rundown house with no real support system. I'd started to suspect she might be slipping mentally, maybe early dementia or something similar. Living that far out, nearly a mile from the closest neighbor, only made it worse. If something serious happened, if she got hurt or sick and couldn't reach a phone, no one would know in time. There wasn't much we could do officially, but I did try. A couple of times I tracked down contact numbers for her kids and called, hoping to talk to them about finding her a safer living situation. The one time I actually got her son on the line, he cut me off halfway through my explanation, said he was busy, and promised to call back later. He never did. After that, none of them ever picked up again, no matter how many messages I left. So, eventually, we stopped trying. That day, Jerry and I turned onto Turner Road and drove up toward her place under a dull gray sky, rain lightly tapping against the windshield. We both assumed it was just another false alarm, another case of her imagination getting the better of her. But when we pulled up, something immediately felt different. She was already outside, standing on the porch waiting for us. And I'll never forget the way she looked. It stopped me cold. She'd always been thin, but now she looked wasted, gaunt, like she'd been drained of something. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pale and tight against her bones. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes, which looked red, sunken, and exhausted. Her gray hair was tangled and greasy, like it hadn't been washed in days, maybe longer. The dress she wore was wrinkled and stained. She looked like she hadn't taken care of herself at all. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was her eyes, the way she stared at us. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Those dark, empty eyes didn't just look at us. They seemed to look through us, past us, like we weren't even there. It reminded me of old war photographs I'd seen. Soldiers coming back from Vietnam with that hollow, distant expression. The look of someone who'd seen something they couldn't process. Something no one should ever have to experience. Jerry and I exchanged a quick glance, both of us clearly unsettled, before stepping out of the cruiser and walking up toward her. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Garrity?" Jerry asked, keeping his tone light and calm. "There's something in my house," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, almost emotionless, but her body trembled slightly. She looked like she was on the edge of collapsing, physically, mentally, maybe both. The way she said it caught my attention. Not someone, something. I raised an eyebrow but kept my expression neutral. "All right," I said gently, trying not to sound dismissive. "Why don't you stay out here, and we'll go take a look, make sure everything's okay." I glanced at Jerry and gave a small nod. We drew our pistols and carefully stepped past Mrs. Garrity, moving into the house with caution. We cleared the first floor the way we always did, methodically, weapons raised, before heading upstairs. The whole sweep took maybe 5 minutes since we knew the layout by heart from all the previous calls. There were no signs of forced entry, no intruders, nothing to suggest a break-in. But there were plenty of other things that unsettled me. The house was in terrible condition. It had always been old and worn, but she used to keep it spotless. Now dirty dishes overflowed in the sink. The counters were grimy, and trash and laundry were scattered across the floors. It looked neglected for weeks. In the living room, her pillow and blankets were piled on the couch like she had been sleeping there. And the coffee table was cluttered with half-empty mugs, open food containers, a Bible, and a rosary, like she had been living entirely in that space. Upstairs, her bedroom looked abandoned, the bed stripped bare and untouched. Then we noticed the shotgun leaning in the corner of the living room, likely her late husband's. Jerry picked it up, broke it open, and found 2 spent shells in the chamber. He sniffed one and quietly told me it had been fired recently, which made my stomach tighten. Then we saw something even stranger. Every mirror in the house had been completely shattered, and every closet door had been boarded shut from the outside. The front hall closet door had a massive hole blasted through the center, with splintered wood around it, clear evidence she had fired the shotgun into it. But why she would do that, neither of us could understand. Jerry looked at me, confused, and I just shook my head, equally lost. After finishing the sweep, we holstered our weapons and turned to head back outside, only to find Mrs. Garrity standing behind us. Neither of us had heard her come in. She was just there, staring at us. We both jumped slightly, startled. Jerry recovered first, forcing a calm tone, as he told her we didn't find anyone and that she was safe. But she didn't relax. Instead, something shifted in her expression. Her eyes changed, filled with a deep, hopeless dread. She said in a flat, hollow voice that she wasn't safe, that it was still there, hiding, and that once we left, it would come back for her. Then she broke down completely, shaking and sobbing uncontrollably. Jerry and I exchanged a concerned look and guided her gently to the couch, sitting beside her and trying to calm her until she regained control. When she finally settled, we asked her to explain what had been happening. She sat quietly for a moment before beginning her story, and as she spoke, I felt a chill spread through me. She said it started about a month ago, with a soft, slow scratching sound coming from inside her bedroom closet at night. At first she thought it was a small animal, maybe a mouse, but the sound came from too high up and felt too deliberate. Every time she opened the closet after the noise stopped, there was nothing there. She tried several times to catch it while it was happening, but whenever she reached for the handle, she would be overwhelmed by an intense sense of dread that stopped her from opening it. She said the scratching felt wrong, almost careful, like something pretending, trying to lure her into opening the door. So she began locking it every night, but over time the scratching grew louder and more aggressive, like something trying to break through. Then one day she opened the door and saw deep scratch marks on the inside, high up, far above where any small animal could reach. And they didn't look like claw marks. They looked like they had been made by fingernails. That, she said, was when everything truly began. About a week after the scratching first began, she woke one night to the sound of a voice softly calling her name. It seemed to be coming from the locked closet door. What unsettled her even more was that she recognized it. It was Bill, her husband, who had been dead for 3 years. The voice pleaded with her, gently at first, telling her that God had sent him back to take her with him, that they could be together again, young and happy like they once were. At that point, Jerry looked at me from across the couch, his eyes wide. "Then what happened?" I asked quietly. She said she thought she must have been dreaming. It had to be a dream, she told herself. Bill had been gone too long for it to be anything else. And since she believed it was only a dream, she didn't see any harm in doing what the voice asked. She got out of bed and walked over to the closet, reaching for the lock. But just before she touched it, she stopped. Something felt wrong. The voice sounded exactly like Bill, but the way it spoke wasn't right. It didn't sound like him. It felt like someone else was using his voice, imitating him, trying to trick her into opening the door. She admitted it didn't make much sense, but honestly, nothing she was telling us did. Still, we asked her to continue. She said the voice kept pleading with her to unlock the door, but when she refused, its tone changed. It became angry, aggressive, demanding that she open it. When she still wouldn't, it started shouting, using foul language and making threats, things Bill would never have said while he was alive. Then it began pounding violently on the door. The voice changed again, growing deeper, distorted, until it no longer sounded human at all. Terrified, she fled the bedroom and spent the rest of the night downstairs on the couch. Eventually, the pounding and shouting stopped. Jerry interrupted her gently at that point and asked why she hadn't called the police when it first happened. She went quiet for a moment, then gave a small, bitter smile. She said she knew what people in town thought of her, that they all believed she was just a crazy old woman. After so many previous calls that turned out to be nothing, she figured we wouldn't take her seriously. She thought maybe it really was all in her head and didn't want to bother us again. But things escalated quickly after that. Every night, the pounding and threats continued. She became too afraid to sleep in her bedroom and started staying on the couch instead. Then one night, it got worse. The banging didn't just come from her bedroom closet anymore. It came from every closet in the house at once, as if something was inside all of them, trying to break out simultaneously. But it was still the same voice, coming from everywhere at once. Terrified, she nailed all the closet doors shut, hoping to keep whatever it was contained. Then, about 2 weeks ago, something even more horrifying happened. She had been in the bathroom washing her hands when she looked up into the mirror and froze. She paused in her story there, trembling. "What did you see?" Jerry asked. Her voice shook as she answered. She said she saw it, its face, instead of her own reflection. It wore a black hooded robe, and beneath the hood was a grinning skull with horns. Its eyes were glowing red, like something out of a nightmare. She made it clear that it wasn't standing behind her, it was inside the mirror itself. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as she described it. She said it reached out toward her, but it didn't have hands, only long, clawed fingers, and it tried to grab her. In panic, she threw a bottle at the mirror, shattering it, and afterward she smashed every other mirror in the house just to be safe. I couldn't help but ask how she had managed to stay there with all of this happening. She gave a sad shrug and said she had nowhere else to go. No one who would take her in. The nights were unbearable, she said, but at least during the day things would stop and she could rest. Whatever it was never bothered her in daylight, until 3 days ago. Her voice trembled as she said that now it never stopped. Day or night, it was always there. She was never safe anymore. That morning, everything had reached a breaking point. The pounding had grown stronger, more violent, until every closet door in the house was shaking in its frame. She knew the boards wouldn't hold forever, that eventually whatever was inside would break through. In desperation, she began praying aloud and reading from her Bible, hoping it would keep the thing away, but it only seemed to make things worse. The entity in the closet had only responded by laughing at her, a cold, mocking sound that made her skin crawl. In desperation, she grabbed her husband's old shotgun and fired straight through the closet door. For a brief moment afterward, everything went silent. She said she actually thought it might finally be over. But then she saw them. Those same red eyes glowing from the darkness inside the hole the blast had torn open. The thing chuckled softly and spoke a single word. I asked her what it had said. "Tonight," she whispered, her body starting to tremble again. She buried her face in her hands and broke down into sobs. Jerry and I sat there in silence for a while, trying to process everything she had told us. We exchanged uneasy looks. Neither of us truly believed her story, but it was clear she was in a fragile mental state. Whether it was a breakdown, age-related decline, or something else entirely, one thing was obvious. She couldn't stay there alone anymore. That house wasn't safe for her. We even considered the possibility that something environmental, like mold, might be affecting her mind. Either way, she needed help. Jerry and I stepped outside for a moment to talk privately and quickly agreed on what to do. When we returned, we told Mrs. Garrity she would be coming with us. We explained that we were taking her into town to stay at a motel for the night, and the next day we'd figure out a more permanent solution. Jerry added, trying to reassure her, that we could even find a priest to come out and bless the house, if that would help put her mind at ease. That seemed to comfort her more than anything. She broke down again, but this time in relief, hugging both of us and thanking us over and over. We drove her into town and checked her into a modest motel. Even in that short time away from the house, she already seemed calmer, more like herself. She smiled weakly and told us she was looking forward to finally getting a proper night's sleep, without the constant fear of something pounding on her doors. More than anything, she just seemed relieved to not be alone anymore. We said our goodbyes and headed back out to the cruiser. The moment we pulled away, the mood shifted. Neither of us said much. We both liked Mrs. Garrity, despite everything. Despite the repeated false calls and the strange behavior, she was still just a lonely old woman who had clearly reached a breaking point. When we got back, we filled the chief in on everything. He listened quietly, then nodded with a heavy sigh. He agreed that she needed to be placed somewhere she could be properly cared for. The plan was to go speak with her children the next day, and if they still refused to step in, the department would make sure she got the help she needed regardless. But none of that ended up happening. The last time we ever saw Mrs. Garrity was when we left her at that motel. Around 4 a.m, I was woken up by a call from the chief. His voice was tense, urgent. He told me to get to the motel immediately but wouldn't explain why. Even without details, I had a bad feeling. As I got dressed, a heavy sense of dread settled in my chest. I wondered if she'd hurt herself. When I arrived, the sight of police tape across the door to her room confirmed my fears, at least part of them. The chief was there, along with Jerry, Pete, and Vance, plus a couple of state troopers and 2 detectives from the city. The chief met me with a grim expression and told me Mrs. Garrity was gone. At first I thought he meant she had died, but when he saw my reaction, he clarified. She wasn't dead. She was just gone. Completely. I stared at him, confused, trying to understand what he meant. Then I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. He admitted he didn't know how to explain it. The people staying in the rooms next to hers had reported hearing horrific screams and sounds of violence coming from her room, sometime around 2 in the morning. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. They called it in. Pete and Vance were the first to respond. They said they knocked hard on the door, calling out to her, but there was no answer. No response, so they'd forced the door open. When they saw what was inside, they'd called the chief himself. "What did they find?" I asked him. "Maybe you ought to come see for yourself." He told me. Leading to the doorway and under the crime scene tape, he explained to me that they'd found no sign of forced entry and that the door and windows of the motel room had all still been locked from the inside when Pete and Vanson showed up. I took a look around, feeling a shiver run through my body. There was fresh blood splattered around the room, on the walls, the floor, the bed, even the ceiling. The blood-stained bed sheets had been ripped away from the mattress, as if someone had desperately tried holding on to them. As they were pulled from the bed, there were 10 very thin trails of blood on the carpet leading away from the bed. 10 thin trails of blood that had been made by 10 desperate, terrified fingers clawing for purchase as their owner was dragged away. I followed the bloody finger marks across the floor, away from the bed to where they ended at the closet. I looked at them, then I looked at the chief. He looked back at me, his face hard and impassive, but I could see fear in his eyes. I approached the closet. The door was standing open. I stood there looking in. For some time, the closet was empty, completely empty. There wasn't even blood on the floor. They never found Mrs. Garrity, Music Part 2. I told you in my last post that the Garrity case was the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and that apart from that, nothing much out of the ordinary has ever happened to me in the course of a mostly uneventful and rather dull career, enforcing the law in a rural middle-of-nowhere town. Most of you have probably never even heard of. Well, until about a week ago. That was mostly true, mostly. But in light of recent circumstances, I feel I have a new story I have to share with you. But first I have to back up a bit and tell you about something that happened about 3 years ago. It was a strange thing, but at the time, I wrote the first story. It hardly seemed important enough to warrant mentioning. Cops get used to dealing with all kinds of weirdos. People reporting, confessing to false crimes and things of that sort. People confessing to murders they didn't commit, etc. I'm sure police departments in the big cities have to put up with crap like that all the time. But even small town departments get it, once in a while. It was, I believe, late June or early July of 19. I was on the night patrol at the time. I usually worked the day, but I was filling in for Vance because he was out to get his appendix removed. Joe, a rookie we took on just the year before, was doing the day patrol with my partner Jerry. It was an early summer evening, and I was in the office shooting the breeze with the chief and Pete just getting ready to punch in for my shift when a woman appeared in the police station. Surprising us, I say appeared, because afterwards when the three of us discussed what happened, we were all in agreement that none of us had seen or heard her enter the room. It was as if one moment she wasn't there. The next she was young, perhaps late teens or early 20s, slender, and might have been pretty, but you wouldn't have known that looking at her in her current condition. For one thing, she was soaking wet. I mean, absolutely drenched head to foot. Her dripping hair was matted and tangled all around her face, and her dress, which I noticed looked kind of old-fashioned, was saturated. She was panting completely out of breath, as if she'd just run a mile, and her eyes were frantic and wide with fear. Another thing I noticed was she was very pale, unnaturally pale. I mean, her skin looked almost bone white. I guess we were all pretty taken aback by her appearance for a few seconds. The three of us, me, Pete and the chief, just gaped at her in shock. "Please," she said, "you have to help me." The chief, who had been sitting at his desk working on a jigsaw puzzle, found his voice. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" he asked a little awkwardly. "Someone kidnapped me. I managed to get away. I think they were going to kill me." We all exchanged a sober look. Things like this didn't happen very often in our town. "Why don't you have a seat and tell us all about it, ma'am?" the chief asked her politely and gestured to an empty chair next to his desk. She sat down, trembling slightly as if she was cold. The chief told Pete to go get a blanket for her, and Pete went to fetch one. The chief asked the young woman if she would care for some coffee, gesturing to the pot sitting on a table across the room. "No, thank you," she said distantly, looking past him into space, distracted or maybe in shock. "What's your name, miss?" the chief asked her. "Shirley," the young woman said, "Shirley Ann McDougal." The chief took a police report form out of his desk drawer and jotted that down. Pete came back into the office carrying a blanket which he offered to Shirley and McDougal. She thanked him and wrapped it gratefully around her shoulders, but continued to shiver through the interview, as if it wasn't possible for her to warm her body back up. "How old are you, Miss McDougal?" 19. He wrote that down. "Where do you live right here in town? And how long have you lived here? My whole life at this?" The chief frowned a little. He threw a questioning look at Pete, who shrugged than me. I shook my head. I could see what was bothering the chief. When you've been a cop in a small town for long enough, you get to know most of the people who live in your jurisdiction. I'd been a cop for 10 years at that point. Pete, who was older than me, had been one for close to 20. And the chief, who was older than both of us, had been one for nearly 40, and yet none of us had ever seen this woman, who claimed to have lived here her whole life, or heard of her, before this night. "What's your address, Miss McDougal?" The chief asked her. "I live with my parents in their apartment above the hardware store. They own McDougal's Hardware on Main Street." That was when I knew there was something really off about this whole deal. There was no McDougal's Hardware on Main Street. In fact, I'd never heard of anyone named McDougal ever living in the area. The chief was looking at Shirley strangely, but he continued doing it by the book and didn't miss a beat. "Now, Miss McDougal, you can call me Shirley," she interrupted softly, still staring off vacantly. "And nothing in particular. Shirley, why don't you tell us exactly what happened tonight?" So, she told us, and her story only got stranger and stranger. I was coming back home from the movies. Me and my friends had gone to see the new Martin Lewis comedy at the Mayan. "Whoa," Pete interrupted her at that point, raising his hand. I'm sorry, you say you went to the buy-in?" "Yes, to see Martin and Lewis. Martin and who, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. We went to see their new film partners. It just opened last week." Pete met eyes with me. The look on his face was a combination of confusion and bewilderment. He mowed the words. What the hell is going on? Shirley just went on anyway. "I was walking back home to my parents and I stopped at Beckman's drugstore to get a chocolate malt. First Beckman's drugstore that rang a bell somewhere in some distant corner of my memory. I dug for it, and after a moment, it came back. Beckman's had been a pharmacy here in town when I'd been a little kid, an independent family-run drugstore, complete with an old-time soda fountain, like something you would have seen back in the 1950s. It had been owned and operated by the Beckmans for 3 generations until the last of them, old Clyde Beckman, had died. Back in the late 90s, his kids had sold the business, and now there was a CVS where it had once stood. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. I was going into the store, but a man approached me outside. He was an older man, maybe in his late 40s, silver hair. He was dressed like a priest, and he had a crutch under one arm. He asked me if I could help him. He said his wallet had fallen under the seat of his car, and he wanted to know if I'd help him get it out. He was very polite, he seemed harmless, and I felt sorry for him, because of the crutch. He led me over to his car. "What kind of car was it?" Shirley, the chief, interrupted her. She thought about it for a few seconds. "I think it was a Buick. Yeah, it was a dark Buick, a couple years old. Maybe a 53 or 54. A 1953 or 54 Buick that, according to Shirley McDougal, was only a couple years old. What the hell was? Was this chick on something? Was she nuts or just pulling some stupid prank?" I searched her face, trying to detect a lie, but she seemed genuinely shaken by whatever she'd been through. "Did you see the license plate, Shirley?" the chief asked. I'd just caught a glimpse as we were going around it. I didn't see the numbers, but I noticed it was an out-of-state car. I think the license plate said Oklahoma. "Then what happened, Shirley?" The chief prodded her gently. I knelt down and I was feeling beneath the driver's seat for his wallet. And then she paused and took a long, shaky breath, then exhaled it sharply as if mustering her courage to recall her ordeal. To herself, something hit me in the head. It hit me hard. It was him, the man dressed like a priest. He hit me from behind. I think with a crutch he was carrying, and then he hit me again. I was stunned. I think I might have even lost consciousness for a few moments when he was dragging me around to the back of his car. I tried to fight him off, but he slapped me and told me to shut up or he'd kill me. He called me, she hesitated. I'd rather not repeat what he said. He lifted the lid of his trunk and shoved me inside, and then he slammed it shut. I was screaming at the top of my lungs and pounding against the truck, but he'd already gotten back in and started the car, and then he was driving. I was screaming and crying, praying, begging him not to hurt me. I told him I just wanted to see my parents again, but he kept driving. I don't know how long he drove. It was a long time, maybe an hour. But then something happened. He had an accident. I heard him shout an alarm, and then the car swerved. I could hear the tires shriek. We went off the road. The next thing I knew, the trunk was filling with cold water. We must have crashed into a lake or a pond. I was panicking, pounding, trying to force the trunk open. And then I don't remember. It just went black for a while. The next thing I remember is splashing around at the surface of the water. I don't know how I managed to get out. I swam to the shore and climbed back onto the road, and I just started walking back into town. Her story finished, Shirley fell silent. She lowered her head, shuddering. None of us knew what to say. We stood there trying to make sense of what she told us. I looked at Pete, then at the chief. The chief looked back at me, a disturbed expression on his face. "May I use the telephone?" Shirley asked. Looking up, "I want to call my parents to tell them." "I'm okay, of course. Shirley, just give us 1 minute. We want to run this guy's description out on the radio. Get an APB going so we can catch this creep." The chief told her, standing up and gesturing for me and Pete to follow him. He led us out of the office and shut the door. "What the hell is she talking about?" Chief Pete asked. "That Mayhem Theater went out of business when I was a kid. 30 years ago. There's a liquor store there now." Yes, and McDougal's Hardware is long gone too." The chief replied, "Long before your time, either of you. It burned down when I was a kid back in '67. I think maybe '68, and the McDougals went up in flames, with it died in their sleep." Pete and me took a moment to absorb that. "So, what the hell's her deal is? She crazy or strung out or what?" The chief shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe something really did happen to her tonight, and the trauma caused a psychotic break. Dissociative identity disorder, whatever they call it." He opened the office door and motioned us back in. Shirley McDougal, or whatever her name really was still sitting beside the chief's desk. She looked up as we entered. "Can I call my parents now?" she asked urgently as the chief sat back down. "They must be worried sick about me. Shirley," the chief said, staring at her thoughtfully, "who's the current U.S. president?" She blinked at him. "What, Dwight Eisenhower? What's this have to do with anything?" The chief looked at her for what seemed like a long time. "Shirley," he asked her softly, "do you know what year it is?" She gave him a puzzled look. "Excuse me, do you know what year it is?" 1956. "Why are you asking me this?" "No, Shirley," he said gently, looking at her with compassion. "It's not 1956. It's 2019. 1956 was 63 years ago." She looked at him confused. 2019. "What are you talking about? Are you crazy? Look at the calendar behind me." "Shirlene," he told her, pointing at the bulletin board on the wall above him. Looking at him suspiciously, Shirley stood and approached the calendar. She stood directly in front of it, staring for some time, then she backed away, her eyes widening in disbelief. No, this is some sort of trick, it has to be," she stammered, terrified and confused. "Shirley," the chief said, pointing at the computer on his desk. "Have you ever seen one of these before?" But Shirley ignored him. Her attention had shifted to a large map of the United States on the opposite wall. She stepped up to it, studying it intently. "Hawaii and Alaska," she muttered quietly to herself. She moved to the window and looked outside at the parking lot. "The cars," she said, her voice rising in panic. "What's wrong with the cars? Why do they look so different?" We stood by the chief's desk, just watching her, dumbfounded and not knowing how to react. Shirley turned to face us, beginning to shudder. She fell to her knees, clutching her midsection, her breath heaving in and out, like she was hyperventilating. I think I'm gonna be sick," she uttered in a low, choked voice. "Please just show me where the ladies' room is. I'm gonna be sick." Pete looked to the chief, who nodded. Grim-faced, Pete helped Shirley to her feet and escorted her out of the office. He looked back at us, and the chief mouthed at him, "Keep an eye on her." Pete nodded. Then they stepped through the door and out of sight. A long, awkward moment of silence passed, with the chief sitting at his desk, distractedly toying with a piece of his jigsaw puzzle, and me standing there, both of us trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. The entire encounter, from the moment the soaking wet woman had entered the police station to when Pete had taken her to use the restroom, had lasted no more than 20 minutes. I finally broke the silence, forcing out a nervous laugh to try to lighten the mood. "Weird night." "Huh?" I said to the chief. He just grunted in response, seeming preoccupied with something. "So, who should we call, the state cops or the hospital?" I asked. He didn't answer me. He was still lost in thought, staring intently straight ahead. "What's on your mind, Chief?" Something just dawned on me a couple minutes ago, just when Pete and her were leaving. He looked at me troubled. 1956 was 2 years before I was born. But McDougal's hardware store was still in town until I was 9. My parents used to do business with the McDougals. I remember something from when I was a kid overhearing my parents talking, something about the McDougals having a daughter that vanished under mysterious circumstances. I looked at him. Come on, Chief, you're not telling me you're actually buying into this thing, are you? It wouldn't be the first time something strange has happened in this town, he said, giving me a pointed look. I think you know what I'm talking about. I didn't answer him, but I did know what he was talking about. In my mind, I saw images I cared not remember. A blood-spattered motel room, sheets torn from the bed, bloody claw marks on a carpet trailing off and stopping abruptly at an empty closet. I shuddered at the memory, and then suddenly there was a commotion from down the hall. Pete was yelling for both of us to come quick. What? Now, I muttered as we hurried out of the office. Pete was standing down the hall just outside the women's restroom. He looked rattled. She's gone, he said as we got closer. What the hell do you mean she's gone? The chief demanded. See for yourself. Pete answered and pushed open the restroom door. We looked in. All 3 stalls were standing with their doors open, vacant. The chief turned to Pete. Well, where the hell did she go? I thought you were watching her. Hey, Chief, I was standing right here outside. The whole time, I swear it, Pete insisted, looking anxious and scared. He muttered something to himself, something I couldn't quite make out. I asked him to repeat it. He looked at me. I'd never seen Pete look so frightened before in my life. I said she was cold when I was helping her up to go to the restroom. My hand touched her arm. It was so cold it was like touching the skin of a corpse. The chief shot me a grim look, which I reciprocated, feeling a stirring of fear in the pit of my stomach. This was too much like what had happened back in 14. The chief and I entered the women's room and looked around. There wasn't much to see and no obvious place to hide, 3 empty stalls and a sink. There was a small window directly above the sink. I approached it, certain I was going to find it locked, but the latch was unfastened. I felt a weird sense of relief at that. That this avenue of denial, this fallback position of logical explanation, hadn't been blocked. Because otherwise, Chief, I said, windows unlocked outside. Quick, he ordered me. Me and Pete hastily followed him down the hallway to the main entrance of the municipal building. We went outside and looked around. All we saw was the front lawn of the building and Main Street. Beyond it, mostly deserted on this early summer evening, the window in the women's restroom faced the left side of the building. We went in that direction, but when we turned the corner, there was nothing there. No sign of the mysterious young woman who called herself Shirley McDougal. I looked up. The window was about 10 feet above the ground, and while small, it was not impossible for someone with a smaller build like Shirley to have squeezed through it. What I'm getting at is that it was conceivable for her to have escaped out. The window dropped to the ground below and then disappeared into the night. The grass had been recently mowed and it hadn't been raining, so the ground hadn't left any footprints we could see to determine which direction she'd gone. We looked at that window for some time. Finally, the chief lowered his head and emitted a slightly shaky chuckle. She must have closed it behind her before she jumped. I guess she was not. Saw Chief, Pete said, guess so. Or lying, or on drugs, or who the hell knows. But that troubled, disturbed look was still in the chief's eyes, and I think he was trying to rationalize what had just happened, as much as I was. Let's go back inside, he told me and Pete. And that's just what we did. It was easier for us to believe that we'd just been dealing with some deeply disturbed young woman, or a flake looking for attention. Because otherwise we would have to accept that what we'd been questioning a ghost that summer night. The chief did report the incident to the state police, and they put out an alert for her, but nothing ever came of it, and we never saw or heard from Shirley and McDougal ever again. I did some research in my free time just out of curiosity, or so I told myself. Searching online and looking through old newspapers and town records, there really had been a young woman named Shirley Ann McDougal, the 19-year-old daughter of Wilbur and Harriet McDougal, the owners of McDougal Hardware, and she really did disappear one night, back in early August of 1956, never to be seen or heard from again. But for all I knew, the crazy woman we dealt with had known about the case and incorporated the details into her delusion. There were no pictures. If you were wondering, I looked but couldn't find anything in. The newspapers I even tried locating any of Shirley's surviving relatives to no avail. It had been over 60 years, and presumably all the family photographs had been destroyed in the fire that killed her parents. I forced it all out of my mind. I was a police officer and there were more pressing matters to deal with. Eventually, I forgot all about my strange encounter with Shirley McDougal. Then last week, I went into the station to start my usual shift. The chief beckoned me into his office, his face pale and grave. He didn't say anything, just pointed to the newspaper on his desk. I picked it up and I looked at the headline. Lake Yields, Dark Secret, after 66 years. One town over some guy in a boat had been trying out his new fish locating sonar, and had inadvertently stumbled upon an old car at the bottom of the lake. 20 feet down, he went to the police and they'd hoisted the car to the surface, an old battered rusted wreck that had once been a 1953 Buick. A set of skeletal remains belonging to a man had been found in the driver's seat. The old Buick had an Oklahoma plate, and when the authorities ran it through the system, they discovered the vehicle was a match for a car registered to a man the FBI had been looking for. Back in the mid-1950s, a drifter and convicted offender they suspected of being a serial killer, or a spree killer, as they called them back then, who was believed to have abducted and murdered up to 10 young women in 6 different states. His last intended victim had managed to escape. She claimed a man dressed as a priest had tried to lure her into his car and then overpower her. This had happened in Iowa, 1 state away from Minnesota. After that, he just vanished off the FBI's radar when they conducted a more detailed inspection of the wrecked Buick. They made a further gruesome discovery. A second skeleton was found in the trunk, a skeleton belonging to a young woman, Music U.